Today, the Office of the Ombudsman will be presenting the findings and outcomes and recommendations that are quite comprehensive that were conducted pursuant to our Act, the Ombudsman Act, and in relation to malfeasances and or delays that were identified in the issuance of vital documentation, that is passports, identity documents, birth certificates, and also the processing of naturalization and permanent residency permits, including the non-surrender of diplomatic passports that have been issued to a myriad of public officers and officials that are no longer deserving to be holding such documentation. Now, the purpose of the investigation itself, the inquiry focused largely on three critical areas, and as I did indicate, there has been a huge persistent outcry around delays in the issuance of these documents and prolonged delays in the processing of residency and naturalization applications, and the unlawful issuance, retention, and misuse of diplomatic passports. So these are not minor administrative concerns, I must indicate. They go to the very core of human dignity and constitutional governance. Identity documents are the legal foundation which individuals access their rights with: the right to free movement, the right to work, the right to study, to receive health care, and to participate fully in the life of this nation. And when the state fails in this regard, it does not merely inconvenience citizens, it denies them of these fundamental rights. Now, the scope and how we went on to undertake the investigation, I should indicate that the investigation took quite a long time because we tried as far as possible to ensure that it was quite extensive and covered almost entirely the entire country. So we covered 7 districts representing approximately 70% of the national territory. We engaged directly with members of the public, affected applicants, ministry officials, including senior leadership. And in total, about 320 individuals were interviewed nationally. We also examined official records and drew from parliamentary findings that had already been made and judicial pronouncements from the Court of Appeal and prior determinations that had been made by this office. So when we come to the key findings that the Ombudsman came to, I can reveal now that the findings were deeply concerning, and they reveal not isolated failures, but a pattern of entrenched maladministration. Amongst the most critical of these findings is that applicants have had to wait for up to 2 years for essential documents, and 65% of the 320 that we interviewed of affected individuals received no explanation whatsoever for delays or the denial of these services. 42% were turned away due to lack of government materials. The ministry has failed entirely to comply with its own service charter. Further, the investigation also found that there was inadequate budget allocation to the Ministry of Home Affairs and Police, and a breakdown in procurement planning and resource management. And there seems to have been lack of foresight in terms of managing even the key contract that had been awarded to one service provider to provide the passport books to the ministry. We also had an outdated and ineffective digital systems. Irregular recruitment practices have also been identified that have influenced by non-merit considerations, and that is quite concerning and constitutes maladministration in its own right. And there's also a failure, again, to enforce laws governing diplomatic passports. So of particular concern is what can only be described as executive inertia, a situation where decisions affecting fundamental rights are delayed indefinitely without justification. Now, when we come to diplomatic passports, the investigation confirmed that former passports well beyond the legally prescribed surrender period. The failure to enforce compliance on the basis of what has been described as a lack of political will is unacceptable and untenable. No law in this country is optional. Now, when we look at the constitutional implications related hereto, the consequences of these failures are quite severe. They amount to violations of fundamental constitutional rights, including our freedom of movement, equity or equality before the law, and protection from inhuman and degrading treatment arising from prolonged administrative uncertainty. And this is not simply poor maladministration, it is a failure of governance. Now, some of the remedial action that the Ombudsman identified, I should point out that the report is not just descriptive of the situation I've laid bare, it is corrective and issues quite, I'd say, directives or directions in terms of what needs to be implemented to correct the malfeasances or maladministrations that have been identified. So the Office of the Ombudsman has issued remedial measures that include, first, one would expect that the political head, being the minister responsible for the Ministry of Home Affairs and Police, should issue a public apology within 30 days of the issuance of this report. And then second to all, there should be a clearance or processing of all documents backlog within the next 60 days from the issuance of this report. And third, appropriate and adequate funding of the Home Affairs and Police Ministry or portfolio by the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning should ensue in the next fiscal budgeting cycle. Finalization of pending naturalization and residency applications should be implemented within 60 days from the issuance of the report. And one would also expect that the Savers Charter, to which they vowed to the nation that they would follow, they need to ensure that there's complete enforcement and implementation thereof of the timelines as prescribed in that Savers Charter and to the letter. And I would also expect of reforms to be made to their procurement systems, including that perhaps there should be a rule book in terms of who the supplier, how they address their dual supplier model for passport production. So one would expect that they should at least have a backup supplier, such that should it happen that the one key supplier has issues, then the other fallback position should be another accredited supplier, but that still utilizes the same passports and prints for the nation. And then again, there should be an immediate cessation of irregular recruitment practices. We established that recruitments, largely therefore temporary staff, are managed within the office of the minister. So they do not necessarily follow proper recruitment and selection processes as prescribed in terms of the laws governing the public service. So we are saying that needs to come to a halt and something needs to be done in that space, because a lot of monies are being redirected towards the payment of staff that is temporarily deployed, and thus what it does now, it limits the actual procurement of consumables that need to go into the production of passport books. So that needs to be seized with immediate effect. The implementation of digitalized systems within the ministry needs to be relooked at. So we expect of digitalization nationally to take place within the next 12 months for that ministry or the department and the ministry itself rather to operate optimally and as expected in the most effective and efficient manner. And I expect of a full audit and enforced surrender of all diplomatic passports for all persons that are no longer deserving to be holding those passports because they are no longer office bearers tasked with public duties as we speak. So that audit needs to ensue, and I would expect of that report to be made available to the Ombudsman in the next 12 months. An independent investigation into corruption that seems to be so entrenched. We identified no less than 4 of the officers to largely be operating under such circumstances. So we are soliciting our sister agency, the DCO, to embark on an independent investigation into corruptive practices within the ministry so that these are addressed wholly. And I would expect again that there should be an establishment of a whistleblower protection and safeguards against intimidation of officials. We've established that often at times when officials seek to implement the law as it applies, they're intimidated or bullied to do that which they should not be doing. And we have made recommendations that we need an anti-bullying policy to be in place and for such individuals to be protected. We have set out in the report how these needs to be done, and that if at all it relates to a minister, the matter needs to be escalated further to Parliament, and first though to the Prime Minister himself to address such behavior, because it is an abuse of power which amounts to maladministration. So in conclusion, I must point out that the findings of the report really point to a systemic breakdown in accountability, efficiency, respect for the rule of law. And this needs to be corrected on an urgent basis and decisively so. The people of Lesotho are entitled to a public administration that is lawful, that is efficient, transparent, and respectful of their dignity. And the Office of the Ombudsman will actively monitor the implementation of these recommendations, and any non-compliance will not be taken lightly. So, ladies and gentlemen, this moment really calls for the leadership to really take accountability seriously and reforms. And the time for delay, honestly, has passed, and the time for action is now. Kaniti Galibo, that is as far as it is. That's the statement. Ka se Senyesemane. Ke a leboha.